Businessman heard baby crying every dawn in the warehouse. But the reality is worse than you think. Richard Miller couldn't sleep anymore. For 3 weeks, that heart-wrenching sound had been waking him up every dawn, always around 3 in the morning. It was a baby's cry, high-pitched and desperate, coming from the disused warehouse of the packaging factory he had built with so much effort. On the 4th consecutive sleepless night, Richard decided this had to stop. It couldn't be a real baby, that was impossible. The warehouse had been closed for months, ever since they moved production to the new building. Maybe it was a trapped cat, or wind whistling through some crack. But that sound seemed so human, so anguished. He got out of bed quietly so as not to wake his wife, and put a jacket over his pajamas. He grabbed the flashlight he kept in the closet and went down the stairs of the large house where he lived, in the residential area next to the factory. The night was cold, typical of June in Pittsburgh, and a thin mist covered the empty parking lot. The crying continued, growing clearer as he approached the warehouse. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. That definitely sounded like a baby crying. His hands trembled as he searched for the right key on the keychain he had brought. The lock was rusty and resisted a bit before giving way. The door creaked as it opened. Richard entered slowly, pointing the flashlight into the dark corners. The crying stopped suddenly, leaving only the heavy silence of the abandoned place. Old machines covered with dusty tarps created strange shadows on the walls. "Is someone there?" His voice echoed in the empty space. No response. Richard took a few more steps forward, illuminating every corner. That's when he heard a different sound. It wasn't crying. It was someone humming softly, a lullaby. He turned the flashlight toward the sound and froze. In the middle of the warehouse, sitting in an old chair, was a white-haired woman. She held something against her chest and rocked back and forth, singing that sad song. The flashlight revealed what she was cradling, a worn cloth doll, the size of a baby. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite the shock. The woman lifted her face. He recognized her immediately. It was Mrs. Dorothy, the company's longest-serving night cleaner. She had worked there for at least 20 years, always discreet, always punctual. But now she was there, in the middle of the night, cradling a doll and weeping profusely. "Mrs. Dorothy, you should be working in the new building. How did you get in here?" She didn't answer, just kept rocking, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Richard moved closer and could see the doll better. It was old, patched in several places, with a little embroidered face that had faded. "Mrs. Dorothy, I'm talking to you." He raised his voice, starting to feel more irritation than concern. "He cries every night," she finally murmured, her voice hoarse. "He won't stop crying. I need to calm him down." Richard felt a chill. This woman was clearly having some kind of mental issue. It wasn't normal, it wasn't acceptable. He thought about the company, about security, about the image this could project. "You're fired." The words came out before he could think better. "Get your things and leave. I'll notify HR in the morning." Mrs. Dorothy stopped rocking. She looked at Richard with an expression he couldn't decipher. Sadness, fear, resignation. She stood up slowly, clutching the doll to her chest, and walked toward the door without saying a word. Richard stood there, watching the hunched figure disappear into the darkness. He felt a slight discomfort, but pushed the feeling away. It was the right decision. He couldn't have unstable employees working at the company. He returned home and managed to get some sleep, convinced that the problem was solved. But the following night, the crying started again. Louder, more desperate. Richard jumped out of bed, furious. How dare she come back after being fired? This time he didn't waste any time. He went straight to the warehouse, still in his pajamas, with the flashlight and cell phone in hand, ready to call security. The door was ajar. She hadn't even bothered to hide. There was Mrs. Dorothy again in the same chair with the same doll, but now there was something more. On the floor around her, scattered like offerings, were small objects: a blue pacifier, a baby shoe, a crocheted blanket. "You are trespassing on private property," Richard yelled, unable to control his anger. "I'm calling the police." "Please," Mrs. Dorothy raised her hand in an almost pleading gesture. Let me explain. There's nothing to explain. Get out of here now or I'll call security. It's my grandson, she said, her voice breaking. The doll, it represents my Tommy. Richard stopped, his finger already on the button to call security. Something in her voice, in the way she said those words, made him hesitate. Your grandson? I raised him since he was a baby. Mrs. Dorothy began to speak, the words tumbling out. His mother, my Linda, had complications during childbirth. She became very weak, never the same again. The father didn't want to take responsibility, so I was the one who took care of Tommy, from day one. Richard lowered his phone but kept a stern expression. He couldn't show weakness. He had problems, she continued, looking at the doll as if it were a real child. He was born with cerebral palsy. He needed a lot of care, a lot of medicine. I worked 3 jobs to give him everything he needed. And where is he now? Mrs. Dorothy closed her eyes, fresh tears welling up. I had to send him away. To my cousin's house out in the countryside of West Virginia. I couldn't take care of him alone anymore. I was getting old, tired, and the money, it was never enough. When was that? 3 years ago. 3 years without seeing my boy. Richard felt a tightness in his chest but tried to ignore it. He couldn't let feelings interfere with his business decisions. I'm sorry about your situation, but that doesn't justify trespassing and behaving this way. You need help. Medical help. I know, she admitted, her voice small. I know it's not normal, but when I hold the doll, when I sing to it, it's like my Tommy is here. It's the only thing that keeps me alive. Why here? Why this warehouse? Mrs. Dorothy looked around as if she saw something Richard couldn't. This is where I brought Tommy for the first time when I got this job. He was so tiny, I had no one to leave him with, so I hid him here in a stroller. I kept running between my cleaning duties and coming to check on him. No one ever found out. Richard didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to throw her out immediately, but another part, one he had been trying to suppress for a long time, felt compassion. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Look, Mrs. Dorothy, he sighed, running his hand through his hair. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to rehire you, but with very clear conditions. No coming to this warehouse, no strange behavior during work. You do your cleaning and go home. Understood? Her eyes lit up for a brief moment. Understood, Mr. Miller. Thank you so much. And see a doctor, a psychologist. I'll have HR check if the company's health plan covers it. Yes, sir. Richard left the warehouse thinking he had solved the problem fairly. He considered himself a fair man after all, tough when necessary but fair. The days passed and the crying didn't return. Richard finally managed to sleep through the night. The factory continued operating normally, producing the packaging that supplied supermarkets throughout the region. He was proud of what he had built. He had started from scratch, using only the severance pay he received after years of working for other companies. Now, he employed over 100 people. But 3 weeks after the warehouse incident, one of the newest employees, Jessica, came to see Richard in his office. She was a woman of about 25, efficient, always keeping an eye out for growth opportunities within the company. Mr. Richard, I need to speak with you about something serious. Go ahead, Jessica. It's about Mrs. Dorothy, the cleaning lady. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Here came trouble. What about her? I've seen her acting suspiciously. She's been carrying large boxes to the old warehouse during the early morning hours. I think she's stealing company materials. Are you sure? Absolutely. I saw it with my own eyes last night. I had stayed late finishing a report and saw her walking by with a huge box. I tried to speak to her, but she ignored me and went straight to the warehouse. Richard felt the anger rising again. He had given that woman a second chance, and she was stealing from him, after everything. Thank you for letting me know, Jessica. I'll investigate personally. That same night, Richard returned to the warehouse. He didn't even wait to hear the crying. He went straight in, determined to catch Mrs. Dorothy red-handed. The door was unlocked again. He entered without making a sound. What he saw left him completely perplexed. The warehouse was no longer empty, There were dozens of boxes stacked against the walls, all organized and labeled. And Mrs. Dorothy was there, not cradling the doll, but knitting. Around her were piles and piles of baby clothes, blankets, hats, and little shoes. "What is all this?" Richard turned on the light, making Mrs. Dorothy jump in surprise. "Mr. Richard, I can explain." "Explain, then." He walked over to the boxes and started opening them. They were all filled with handmade items, carefully folded. There were labels with dates and names he didn't recognize. "I make them in my spare time," Mrs. Dorothy said, standing up. "During the early mornings, when I can't sleep. I use fabric scraps from the factory, the ones that were going to be thrown away anyway. Scraps that belong to the company. I know it's wrong. But they were going to the trash anyway. And I needed to do something. I needed to feel useful." "For what? What is all this for?" Mrs. Dorothy looked at the boxes with a tender expression. "For the children. I send everything anonymously to shelters here in the region, to hospitals too. They're children in need, who have no one." Richard was silent for a moment, processing the information. It wasn't exactly theft, but it wasn't right either. They were company materials, even if they were scraps. And these labels, these names, they're the children who will receive the items. I asked the nurses and social workers to send me the names. That way I embroider each child's name on their clothing, so they feel like someone cares about them, that someone thought specifically of them. You didn't have permission to take these materials. I know, Mr. Richard, you can fire me again if you want, but please let me finish delivering what I've already made. There's a little girl at the hospital who's waiting for the pink blanket. I promised her. Richard felt torn. On one hand, this woman was using company property without authorization. On the other, she was doing something good, something he himself would never have thought to do. "We'll talk about this on Monday," he said, leaving the warehouse. But on Saturday morning, Jessica showed up at his office again. Richard was still there, trying to resolve some supplier issues. "Mr. Miller, I heard you went to the warehouse yesterday. So, are you going to fire her?" "I'm assessing the situation." "Assessing?" Jessica seemed surprised. "She stole from the company. That's unacceptable." "They were leftovers, materials that were going to be discarded." "But they're company property," Jessica insisted, and Richard noticed something strange in her tone. There was too much urgency, too much interest in that matter. "Why are you so concerned about this, Jessica?" "Concerned? I'm just looking out for the company's interests, Mr. Miller, unlike other employees who take things that aren't theirs." Richard decided to investigate further. He asked the stock supervisor to conduct a full audit. The results came in on Monday and were a surprise. Much more valuable materials were missing. Not fabric scraps, but entire rolls of new material. And the unauthorized removals had started about 6 months ago, well before Mrs. Dorothy began her project in the warehouse. Richard called Jessica into a private meeting. "I need you to explain these material removals." He showed her the audit reports. The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're talking about. The security cameras show you carrying boxes to the parking lot several times, always at the end of your shift on Friday." Jessica began to stutter, trying to make up excuses. Richard listened to everything in silence and then fired her for just cause. She left the office screaming, accusing him of favoring long-time employees. After she was gone, Richard stood looking out the window at the old warehouse. All of this made him question many things. He had built that company focusing only on profit, on efficiency, on results. He had never stopped to think about the people who worked for him, about the stories each one carried. That afternoon he looked for Mrs. Dorothy. She was cleaning the cafeteria, as she always did. When she saw him, she grew tense, expecting the worst. "Mrs. Dorothy, about what you're doing in the warehouse." "I'll get my things right away, Mr. Miller." "No," he interrupted. "I don't want you to stop. I want to make it official. The company will formally donate the fabric scraps for your project, and we'll find a better space for you to work." She looked at him in disbelief. "Are you serious?" "I am, but I have one condition." "What is it?" "I want to meet your grandson. I want to better understand your situation." Mrs. Dorothy hesitated. Richard realized there was something more, something she hadn't yet told him. "He's very far away, Mr. Miller." That's okay, we can do a video call. There's no good internet where he lives. And my cousin, she doesn't have a phone. How do you communicate with him then? By letters. I send a letter every month. And does he reply? Mrs. Dorothy's silence was revealing. He doesn't reply, does he? She shook her head, tears beginning to fall. I don't even know if he receives them. I don't know if he's okay. I don't know if he still remembers me. Richard felt his heart tighten. That woman had been suffering for 3 years, not knowing if the grandson she raised was well, if he still thought of her. I'll help you find him. The words came out before Richard could think. How? I have contacts. I can hire someone to go there, check how he is. I don't have money for that, Mr. Miller. I'll pay. I can't accept charity. It's not charity, it's... He paused, searching for the right words. It's the right thing to do. Over the following days, Richard hired a private investigator to locate Mrs. Dorothy's grandson. It wasn't difficult to find the cousin's address in rural West Virginia. The hard part was what they discovered when they got there. Tom, Mrs. Dorothy's grandson, was living in poor conditions. The cousin, who had promised to take care of him, actually kept him in a small back room of the house, giving only the bare minimum of attention and care. The money that Mrs. Dorothy sent religiously every month was diverted to other things. When Richard received the report with photos, he felt a rage he hadn't felt in a long time. But he couldn't just show that to Mrs. Dorothy. She would be devastated. He needed to be careful. He called her for a private conversation. We found your grandson. Her face lit up in a way Richard had never seen. Is he okay? He needs you, Mrs. Dorothy. He needs to come back to be near you. But I don't have the means. We'll figure it out. But first I need to tell you some things we discovered. He was as delicate as possible, but there was no easy way to say it. Mrs. Dorothy listened to everything in silence, her face growing paler and paler. When Richard finished, she broke down in sobs. My Linda warned me, she said through tears. Before she passed, she told me not to trust the cousin, but I had no one else. I was alone and needed someone to take care of him. Your daughter passed away. Mrs. Dorothy nodded. It's been 2 years. One day after I sent Tommy to West Virginia. She never recovered from the childbirth complications. She faded away little by little. When she finally rested, it was a week after Tommy left. That's why I couldn't go get him back. I was so devastated, so guilty. I felt like I had abandoned my boy. Richard didn't know what to say. That woman had lost so much, suffered so much. We'll bring him back, he said, with a determination that surprised even himself. But how? I don't have a suitable home. I can't afford to take care of him. We'll find a solution. In the following days, Richard dove into the problem as if it were a business challenge. He researched adapted housing, support programs for people with special needs. But every solution he found ran into the same problem: money. Mrs. Dorothy simply didn't have the resources. It was then that his wife, Nancy, noticed how involved he was in this. Richard, you're obsessed with this, she said one night while he was working on the computer. It's not obsession, it's responsibility. Responsibility? She's just an employee. She's a person, Nancy, a person who is suffering. And you think you're going to solve this with money? I can at least try to help. Nancy sighed. You've changed. I don't know if for better or worse, but you've changed. Richard didn't answer. She was right. Something had changed in him since he found Mrs. Dorothy in that warehouse. It was as if he had woken from a deep sleep. The next day he went to see the company lawyer, Dr. Wilson. I need a survey on labor rights, specifically about retirement and benefits. For whom? For Mrs. Dorothy, the custodian. Dr. Wilson seemed surprised but did the work. A week later he came back with interesting news. Richard, this woman is entitled to a special retirement she never applied for. With all her contribution time and her grandson's situation, she could have been receiving a considerable amount for years. Why did she never apply? She probably didn't know, or didn't understand the bureaucracy. It's common. Richard called Mrs. Dorothy again. Why did you never retire? She seemed confused by the question. Retire, but I can still work. But you're of age for it. And with your grandson's case, you're entitled to special benefits. I didn't know that. And if you had known, would you have applied? Mrs. Dorothy was silent for a moment. No, she finally admitted. Working is the only thing that keeps me alive. If I stop, if I'm just thinking about everything I've lost, I don't think I can bear it. Richard understood. It wasn't about money. It was about purpose, about feeling useful. Chad, what if there was a way for you to work differently, doing something you truly love? What do you mean? The little clothes you make, the work you do with the children, what if that became your official job? Her eyes widened. I don't understand. I'm thinking of turning the warehouse into a community space, a place where you could coordinate social projects, make your handmade crafts, help others learn too. But I'm not qualified for that. Mrs. Dorothy, you have something much more valuable than qualifications. You have love for what you do. She was moved, but still hesitant. And my Tommy, he needs special care. I can't coordinate anything and take care of him at the same time. Then we'll make that part of it too, an adapted common area. That conversation was the beginning of something bigger than Richard Miller imagined. He started sharing the idea with other employees, expecting resistance. But to his surprise, many embraced the project, especially the older women who identified with Mrs. Dorothy's story. One of them, Mrs. Margaret, who worked in the sewing department, approached Richard. Mr. Richard, I'd like to participate in this project. I also know how to do crafts and always wanted to help someone. Please just call me Richard, and of course you can participate. There's something you need to know about Mrs. Dorothy, Margaret said, her voice low. What? She was a teacher. Many years ago, before working here, she was a special education teacher. Richard felt as if he'd been punched. What do you mean? Why did she never mention it? It was a difficult time. Her daughter got sick, needed constant care. Dorothy had to leave her job. When she tried to return, they said she was too old, that she'd been out of the job market too long. That's when she started working in cleaning. So she has a degree then? Yes. She even has a specialization. But she never wanted to go back after everything she went through. That information completely changed Richard's perspective. Mrs. Dorothy wasn't just a kind-hearted custodian. She was a qualified professional whom life's circumstances had pushed down a different path. He approached her again. Why did you never tell me you were a teacher? Mrs. Dorothy lowered her eyes. That was a long time ago. Another life. But it's important. It changes everything. It changes nothing, Mr. Richard. I'm just an old woman who cleans floors. You're more than that, and you know it. She fell silent. After I left the school where I worked, I tried to go back a few times, but nobody wanted to hire a 50-year-old woman who'd been out for years. They said methods had changed, that I was outdated. After so many closed doors, I gave up. I accepted that my place was elsewhere. What if I told you your place was never cleaning floors? That you've always been an educator and can be one again? I'm 68. Nobody will want to hear what I have to say. I do. The children who receive your little clothes do. Their mothers do. Mrs. Dorothy looked at Richard with tears in her eyes. Why are you doing this? Why are you being so good to me? Richard thought about the answer. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was something deeper. Because you reminded me of why I started this company. It wasn't to get rich, it was to create something that mattered, and somewhere along the way I forgot that. The warehouse renovation began the following week. Richard invested his own resources in the project, but also opened it up to employee donations. The participation was greater than he expected. People he thought didn't even know who Mrs. Dorothy was showed up with contributions. It was during the renovation that they found something unexpected. While digging to make adjustments to the foundation, the workers discovered a metal box buried. Inside were old factory documents. Documents that Richard had never seen before. He called Dr. Wilson to examine the papers. What is this? The lawyer flipped through the documents, his expression growing increasingly serious. Richard, these are the original partnership contracts for the company from when your father founded the factory. My father founded it alone. Not exactly. There was another partner, someone who invested startup capital and worked in the early years, but later had his share bought out, or at least that's what the official documents say. But here, he pointed to a yellowed paper. Here's a handwritten letter from the other partner, saying he never agreed to the sale, that he was forced to accept it. Who was this partner? Dr. Wilson turned the paper over, revealing the signature. Anthony Ferguson. Richard felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. Ferguson was Mrs. Dorothy's maiden name. This can't be a coincidence. Probably not, you'll have to ask her. But Richard didn't get the chance. That same afternoon, he received a call from the hospital. Mrs. Dorothy had fainted at work and was being treated in the emergency room. He rushed there, finding her on a stretcher connected to IVs. What happened? The doctor called him aside for a private conversation. She's severely malnourished. From the history we've gathered, she's been eating very poorly for months, probably saving money to send to her grandson. Will she be okay? Yes, but she needs follow-up care. And we discovered something else during the exams. She has diabetes. It's uncontrolled because she's not taking her medication regularly. Why? She said the medications are expensive. She was buying them cut, only taking them when she felt very sick. Richard felt guilt crush his chest. How had he not noticed? How had he let an employee reach this point? He stayed at the hospital until Mrs. Dorothy woke up. When she opened her eyes and saw him there, she tried to smile. "I'm sorry, Mr. Richard. I didn't want to cause any trouble. Don't talk nonsense. You're staying here until you're completely recovered. But work can wait. You can't." In the following days, while Mrs. Dorothy recovered, Richard began investigating her husband's story. He discovered that Anthony Ferguson had indeed been a founding partner of the factory, along with Richard's father. But there had been a dispute, something related to unpaid investments and decisions made without consultation. In the end, Anthony had been forced to sell his share for a price well below market value. He had passed away 10 years ago, bitter and resentful, and Mrs. Dorothy had known nothing about it because her husband had never told her about the partnership. She only knew that he had worked at the factory many years ago. Richard felt conflicted. On one hand, this explained why Mrs. Dorothy had such an attachment to that place. On the other, it revealed a debt that might never be fully repaid. When she was discharged, he took her for a serious conversation. "I need to ask you something. Was your husband Anthony Ferguson?" She seemed surprised by the question. "Yes, he was. Why?" "He was a founding partner of the factory, along with my father." The color drained from her face. "I didn't know that." "He never told you?" "Anthony was very private. He never talked about work at home. I only know that he worked there for many years, then left and never wanted to hear about that place again. He was forced to sell his share in the company for an unfair price." Mrs. Dorothy fell silent, processing the information. "That's why his last years were so difficult," she finally said. "He became bitter, distant, but he never explained why to me. I'm sorry that happened. If I had known earlier, you're not to blame for your father's mistakes, Mr. Richard, but I have the responsibility to correct them. I don't want anything. I'm not asking for anything. I know, but even so, I need to do what's right." Richard spent the following weeks talking with lawyers, accountants, and the other partners who had joined the company later. The solution they found was to transform part of the warehouse project into a kind of historical reparation. Mrs. Dorothy would not only have a space to work, but also a share in the results of that specific project. But when he presented the proposal, she refused. "I can't accept this." "Why?" "Because it's not mine. I didn't work for it." "Your husband did. He helped build this company. But he's gone now, and I don't want anything I haven't earned with my own effort." Richard felt frustrated. He tried to argue, but Mrs. Dorothy was stubborn. In the end, they reached a compromise. She would agree to coordinate the warehouse project, but as a hired employee with fair pay and benefits. No partnership, nothing that sounded like charity. Meanwhile, preparations to bring Tom back were moving forward. Richard sent a lawyer to West Virginia to handle all the paperwork. The cousin, realizing she could face legal trouble, didn't create any difficulties. The day Tom arrived, half the factory stopped to see him. He was an 18-year-old young man, thin, with uncoordinated movements due to cerebral palsy, but with bright eyes and a shy smile. When he saw his grandmother waiting at the factory entrance, he sped up his wheelchair as much as he could. Mrs. Dorothy ran to meet him, falling to her knees and hugging him as if she never wanted to let go. There wasn't a dry eye among the employees present. Richard felt his own tears streaming down and didn't try to hide them. "Grandma," Tom said, his speech slightly slurred but filled with emotion, "I thought you had forgotten me." "Never, my boy, I could never forget you. Why did it take so long to come get me?" Mrs. Dorothy had no answer for that. How could she explain to her grandson that she simply hadn't been able to, that life had crushed her in a way she couldn't recover from? "It doesn't matter," Tom said, holding her hand. "I'm here now. We're together." Tom's arrival brought new life not only to Mrs. Dorothy, but to the entire factory. He had something special, an incredible ability to create music. Even with all his physical limitations, he could play the keyboard in a way that left everyone impressed. Richard saw him playing one day during the lunch break. It was a simple melody but filled with feeling. "Did you make up this song?" Tom nodded shyly. "I made it thinking about Grandma, about the 3 years we were apart. It's beautiful. I make a lot of them. Music is the only thing I can do right." It's not the only thing, but it is special. An idea began to form in Richard's head. What if Tom could teach music to other children? What if that became part of the warehouse project? But when he suggested it, he met resistance not from Tom, but from Mrs. Dorothy. "He needs to recover first. He's too weak." "I understand. But when he's ready, I'd like him to consider it." The weeks passed, and the warehouse was getting ready. It was no longer an abandoned, dark space. Natural light came in through new windows. Walls were painted in cheerful colors. Work tables were organized. And in a special corner, a small music studio with adapted instruments. The opening was scheduled for a Saturday. Richard expected maybe 20 or 30 people, but when he arrived at the location, he found the parking lot full. There were hundreds of people there. "Who are all these people?" he asked Margaret. "They're the families Mrs. Dorothy has helped over the years. The children who received little clothes, the mothers who got blankets, the fathers who saw their children in the hospital receive little hats embroidered with their names. They all came to thank her." Richard was speechless. He had no idea of the extent of Mrs. Dorothy's work. For years, she had made a difference in the lives of hundreds of people, all by herself, all in silence. The ceremony was simple. Mrs. Dorothy stood in the center of the warehouse with Tom by her side. Several people stood up to speak, sharing stories of how that lady had helped them in difficult times. One mother told how her premature son had received a little blue blanket when he was in the NICU, and how that brought comfort in a time of despair. A father spoke about the little hat his daughter with cancer had received, embroidered with her name, and how it made her feel special amid so much suffering. Story after story, Richard began to understand the real impact of that humble woman. She hadn't changed the world, but she had changed the world for each of those people. When it was his turn to speak, Richard didn't know where to begin. "I met Mrs. Dorothy in an unusual way," he said, deciding to be honest. "I thought she was crazy. I thought she was doing something wrong. And both times I was mistaken. She taught me that success isn't measured in money, but in lives touched. That power doesn't come from commanding people, but from serving them. That—" His voice broke. He looked at Nancy, his wife, who was in the front row with teary eyes. He looked at the factory workers, all there to support a colleague. He looked at Mrs. Dorothy and Tom, hugging and smiling. "She reminded me why it's worth waking up every morning, and for that I will be eternally grateful." The applause was emotional and long. Mrs. Dorothy stood up with difficulty and asked to speak. "I don't know how to make pretty speeches," she began, her voice trembling. "I only know how to work. I only know how to try to help where I can. But I want to thank Mr. Richard for giving me this chance, for seeing in me something I no longer saw in myself, for bringing my Tommy back, and for turning this place, which was dark and empty, into a space full of light and hope. She paused, looking around. My husband helped build this factory, but he never saw what it could become. He never imagined that this place wouldn't just produce boxes, but produce hope. Now I see that his work wasn't in vain, that everything has a purpose. It was Tom who asked to speak next. With some difficulty, he stood up from his chair, leaning on his grandmother. He stopped, gathering strength. I want to teach music to other children who are like me, so they can see they can create beautiful things, even when the body doesn't help. Emotion took over the warehouse again, and it was at that moment that Richard realized that all of this was bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't about fixing a past mistake. It was about building a different future. In the following months, the warehouse project flourished. Mrs. Dorothy coordinated a group of volunteers who produced crafts to donate. Tom gave music lessons 3 times a week, and surprisingly, other companies in the region began to show interest in the model. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some shareholders in Richard's company didn't like the idea. They thought it was a waste of resources, that it didn't generate direct financial return. A meeting was scheduled to discuss the future of the project. Richard entered the conference room already expecting a battle. Look, Richard, began one of the main shareholders, Mr. Anderson. We understand your enthusiasm, but this is taking focus away from the main business. It's not taking focus away from anything. It's adding value to our brand. Value? Another shareholder, Mr. Thompson, laughed. I haven't seen that value reflected in the numbers, because you're only looking at the quarterly balance sheet. You're not seeing the bigger picture. The bigger picture, Mr. Anderson leaned forward. The bigger picture is that we are a packaging company, not an NGO. And who said we can't be both? The discussion went on for hours. Richard presented data showing how employee engagement had increased, how the turnover rate had dropped, how productivity had improved, but the numbers alone weren't convincing. That's when Mrs. Dorothy appeared at the conference room door. Richard hadn't called her, but she was there. May I speak? She asked, humbly. The shareholders exchanged glances, surprised. Richard gestured for her to enter. Gentlemen, she began, her hands trembling slightly. I've worked at this company for 20 years. I've cleaned every corner, every room, every bathroom in this building. I've seen a lot over these years. I've seen good times and bad times. And I've seen people arrive full of dreams and leave frustrated. Mrs. Dorothy, we don't mean to disrespect you, but... Mr. Anderson began. Please, let me finish, she interrupted him with a firmness that surprised everyone. I've seen this company grow. I saw when you bought shares, when profits soared, when you opened new branches. And do you know what else I saw? I saw you losing the reason why people want to work here. Silence weighed heavily in the room. Money is important, yes, but it's not everything. People want to be part of something bigger. They want to feel their work matters. The warehouse project doesn't take focus away from the business. It reminds everyone why we're here. With all due respect, Mr. Thompson said, but you don't understand business. No, I don't understand spreadsheets and charts, Mrs. Dorothy admitted, but I understand people, and people are what make a company work. They're not machines, they're not numbers, they're people. Richard saw something change in the expression of some shareholders, not all but some. What do you propose then? Asked Mr. Anderson, his tone less hostile. That you turn this project into something even bigger, that it's not just charity but a real business, a cooperative that generates income that's sustainable, that shows it's possible to profit while doing good. The idea was bold, and surprisingly, it began to make sense to some of those present. How would it work? Asked one of the younger shareholders, Dr. Caroline. We produce quality handmade pieces. We sell to companies that want exclusive products to gift clients. The profit is divided among the artisans, and part goes back to train new professionals. And who would manage this? Me, Mrs. Dorothy said without hesitation, with help from anyone who wants to volunteer. I don't need a high salary. I just need you to let me try. Richard felt proud. That woman he had found months ago, lost and depressed in an abandoned warehouse, was now there, proposing an innovative business model. The vote was close, but in the end, the project was approved. With conditions, it had to become self-sustaining within a year. If it didn't succeed, it would be shut down. Mrs. Dorothy accepted the challenge, and in the following months, she worked like Richard had never seen anyone work. She recruited other artisans, established partnerships with suppliers, created product catalogs. Tom organized musical presentations for corporate events, generating additional income. The project started small but grew quickly. The quality of the pieces drew attention. Companies began placing large orders, and the difference wasn't just the product but the story behind it. Richard watched all this with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He had always considered himself a good businessman, but Mrs. Dorothy was showing him things he had never imagined. She didn't work for money, she worked for purpose, and that made all the difference, but not everything was perfect. Tom started having health problems. The music lessons tired him too much. He needed regular physical therapy, constant medical monitoring. And all this was expensive. Mrs. Dorothy went back to working 3 jobs. Besides coordinating the warehouse project, she took on night cleaning jobs elsewhere. Richard tried to convince her to stop, but she was stubborn. "I need to make sure my grandson has everything he needs." "But you'll work yourself to death this way." "I won't. I've been through worse." It was Nancy, Richard's wife, who had an idea. "What if we create a fund to help with Tom's medical expenses? Not just his, but other children in the same situation." "How so?" "A portion of the cooperative's profits could go to a health fund, accessible to all artisans and their families." The idea was brilliant. Richard presented it to Mrs. Dorothy, expecting her to refuse out of pride. But she surprised him. "I accept, but not just for Tom, for everyone who needs it." The fund was created and quickly proved essential. Several families benefited, and most importantly, it created a sense of community. People weren't just co-workers, they were a support network. 1 year after the project's launch, the moment of truth came. The shareholders gathered to evaluate the results. Richard entered the conference room with a heavy heart. He knew the numbers were good, but would they be good enough? Mrs. Dorothy was nervous beside him. Tom had also come, in his wheelchair. Mr. Anderson opened the meeting. "Well, let's get to the facts. The cooperative project was expected to lose money in the first year. We all expected that. The question was whether the loss would be manageable." He made a dramatic pause. To our surprise, there was no loss. The project became self-sustaining in the 8th month, and in the 12th month it generated a profit. Murmurs of surprise filled the room. "Furthermore," continued Dr. Caroline, "we saw a positive impact throughout the company. Employee satisfaction increased by 40%, productivity rose 20%, and we received positive mentions in the press that are priceless." Richard could hardly believe it. Not only had the project survived, but it had thrived. "There's more," Mr. Anderson said. "Other companies in the region approached us, wanting to replicate the model. There's potential to franchise the idea, create similar cooperatives in other cities." Mrs. Dorothy held Tom's hand, tears streaming down her face. "All this thanks to you," Dr. Caroline said, looking at her. "Your vision, your persistence. Thank you for not giving up on us when you could have simply accepted the severance." The meeting ended with applause, and with a proposal. Mrs. Dorothy should become the company's official consultant, helping to implement similar projects in other units. She accepted, but with one condition. "I want the warehouse to continue being coordinated by someone from here, someone who knows the story, who lived through all this." "Who do you suggest?" "Margaret. She's been with me from the start. She knows how to do everything I know, and she has her heart in the right place." Margaret, who was at the meeting as a guest, was moved. She accepted immediately. In the following months, Richard saw his world change completely. The factory was no longer just a place of production. It was a place of transformation. People arrived broken and left rebuilt. They arrived without hope and left with purpose. One of those people was himself. Richard realized he had spent years focused only on growing, on profiting, on winning. But he had forgotten to live. He had forgotten to connect with the people around him. Nancy noticed the change. "How you seem lighter," she said one evening. "Do I?" "Yes, I haven't seen you like this in a long time." I think I finally understood what's important. And what is that? It's not how much you accumulate, it's how much you give. But the story didn't end there. There was one last chapter, one last revelation. Dr. Wilson, the lawyer, approached Richard with an old envelope. I found this among the documents we were organizing. It's a letter, written by your father shortly before he passed away. Richard opened the envelope carefully. He recognized his father's handwriting immediately. Richard, if you're reading this, it's because I'm already gone. There's something I need to confess. Something that's been weighing on my conscience for decades. I was unfair to Anthony Ferguson. He was more than a partner. He was a friend. But when the company started growing, I let greed speak louder. I used a technical clause in the contract to force him to sell his share. He was right to feel betrayed. I tried to make up for it in various ways over the years, but my pride was always greater than my courage. I never had the humility to apologize. If the Ferguson family ever needs help, I hope you have the courage I lacked. Correct the mistake I made. Do what's right, not what's easy. Your father. Richard read and reread the letter several times. Everything made sense now. The warehouse, Mrs. Dorothy's attachment to that place, everything. He looked for Mrs. Dorothy and showed her the letter. Your father was a good man, she said after reading. Deep down he was. We all make mistakes. But he made a serious mistake, and he made my husband suffer. He did. But it wasn't out of malice, it was out of fear. Fear of losing what he had built. How can you be so understanding? Because holding a grudge doesn't change the past. It only makes the present heavier. Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've taught me. You don't need to thank me. Just keep doing good. Keep turning this place into something your father and my husband would be proud of. I will. I promise. 2 years after that first meeting in the warehouse, Richard was standing in the same place. But now it was completely different. The space was full of life, colors, laughter. Dozens of people worked there, creating, teaching, learning. Tom was giving a music lesson to a group of children, some in wheelchairs, others on crutches, all smiling. Mrs. Dorothy moved between the craft tables, guiding, helping, hugging. Nancy was there too, now an active part of the project. She had discovered a passion for helping that she didn't know she had. Richard looked around and felt a peace he had never experienced before. It wasn't the peace of someone with money in the bank or business success. It was the peace of someone who knows they're making a difference. What are you thinking about? Nancy asked, approaching. About how everything has changed, about how I've changed. For the better? Definitely for the better. A group of visitors arrived. It was a delegation of business people from another city, interested in replicating the model. Mrs. Dorothy went to greet them with the same humility as always, but now with the confidence of someone who knows the value of what they've built. Richard watched everything with pride. That woman he had almost sent away, whom he thought was crazy, had transformed not only his company but his life. And it all started with crying in the middle of the night. A cry that wasn't from a baby, but from a wounded soul calling out for purpose. A cry he almost ignored, but fortunately decided to investigate. At night, when everyone had already left, Richard stayed alone in the warehouse for a few minutes. He looked at the chair where he had found Mrs. Dorothy for the first time. He remembered the cloth doll, the despair in her eyes. "Thank you," he said aloud, to no one in particular. To the universe, perhaps, to the chance that had put them in each other's path. Thank you for not letting me ignore that cry. Because if I had ignored it, if I had simply called security and moved on, I would have missed the opportunity to learn the most important lesson of my life. That true success isn't measured in money, but in lives touched. That power doesn't come from commanding but from serving. That the most unlikely people can teach us the most important lessons. And that sometimes, when we're at rock bottom, lost and desperate, all we need is someone to stop and listen to our cry. But the story didn't end in that moment of peace. Life has a peculiar way of reminding us that nothing is permanent, that every achievement brings new challenges. 3 months after that quiet night in the warehouse, Richard received a call that would change everything again. It was from the hospital. Tom had been urgently admitted. His condition, which had always been delicate, had suddenly worsened. Richard dropped everything and rushed to the hospital, finding Mrs. Dorothy in the hallway, completely helpless. She seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. What happened? I don't know, she sobbed. He was fine yesterday. He taught class, played piano. He was happy. This morning he couldn't get out of bed. He couldn't move properly. The doctors were clear. Tom needed complex spinal surgery. Something that had been developing for years, but had now reached a critical point. Without the surgery, he could lose all movement. And with the surgery? Richard asked. There are chances for significant improvement, but there are also risks. And the cost? The doctor hesitated. How much? When they heard the amount, Mrs. Dorothy almost fainted. It was an impossible sum. Even with the health fund they had created, it wouldn't be enough. I'll pay, Richard said immediately. No, Mrs. Dorothy held his arm. You can't. You've already done too much. It's not about what I've already done. It's about what needs to be done. But, Mrs. Dorothy, please, let me help. She looked at him, tears streaming down her face, and finally nodded. She had no choice. Her grandson's life was at stake. The surgery was scheduled for the following week. They were days of anguish, waiting, prayer. Richard found himself praying for the first time in decades. He wasn't religious, never had been, but at that moment he needed to believe there was something greater, something that could help that young man. On the day of the surgery, half the factory stopped. Not officially, but people worked on autopilot, their minds and hearts at the hospital. Margaret organized a support chain, with employees taking turns keeping Mrs. Dorothy company. Richard stayed with her the whole time. 7 hours of surgery that felt like 7 years. When the doctor finally came out with news, they both jumped up. It went well, the doctor said, and Mrs. Dorothy nearly collapsed with relief. But the recovery will be long. Months of intensive physical therapy. I can't promise results, but there is hope. Hope. That was all they needed. In the months that followed, everyone's life revolved around Tom's recovery. Mrs. Dorothy practically lived at the hospital. Richard insisted she take paid leave from work, and this time she didn't argue. But without Mrs. Dorothy, the warehouse project began to show cracks. Margaret did the best she could, but she didn't have the same emotional connection, the same natural charisma. Some artisans started missing work. The quality of the products dropped a bit. Customers complained about delivery delays. Richard tried to intervene, but he didn't have the right touch. He was good with business, spreadsheets, strategies. But that project needed heart, not brains. And the heart was at the hospital, beside a bed, holding the hand of a grandson fighting to regain his movement. It was Nancy who suggested something different. What if we brought Tom to do physical therapy at the company? What do you mean? We can adapt a room, hire physical therapists. That way Mrs. Dorothy can be near him and still coordinate the project. I don't know if it's feasible. Of course it is. You just have to want to. Richard thought about the idea. It was unusual, but it made sense. He talked to the doctors, who approved. He talked to Mrs. Dorothy, who was moved. And in 2 weeks, they had a fully equipped physical therapy room next to the warehouse. Mrs. Dorothy's return brought new life to the project, and seeing Tom working hard in physical therapy motivated all the employees. It was impossible to complain about a tiring day when you saw that young man struggling to move a finger, celebrating every small achievement as if it were an Olympic victory. But the problems weren't over. Mr. Anderson, one of the shareholders, began questioning the investments in the social project again. Richard, I need to talk to you about the numbers. What numbers? The costs for the physical therapy room, the equipment, all this. He searched for the right word. Social apparatus. And? It's starting to weigh on the budget. We can't keep funding all this. The project is still profitable. Yes, but the extra costs with Tom, they're temporary. Are they? And when another case comes up, will we fund that too? Richard felt his irritation rising. If necessary, yes. That's not how you run a company, Richard. You're letting emotion speak louder than reason. And you're letting reason extinguish your humanity. The discussion heated up. Other shareholders became aware. A clear division began to form. Those who supported Richard's more human approach and those who wanted to return to a purely commercial focus. An extraordinary meeting was called. Richard knew he could lose control of the company he had built, but he wasn't willing to give in. "Gentlemen," he began, when everyone was gathered, "I know there are concerns about the direction the company is taking. I understand these concerns, but I need to make something clear. I won't change course." "Richard, be reasonable," Mr. Anderson began. "Let me finish," he interrupted him. "When I started this company, I had a dream. It wasn't to get rich, it was to build something that mattered. At some point, I lost sight of that dream, but now I've regained it, and I won't lose it again. But the costs are manageable. The numbers I brought prove that." He distributed detailed reports. "What some of you see as expenses, I see as investment. Investment in people, in loyalty, in purpose." "Purpose doesn't pay bills," said Mr. Thompson. "No? Then how do you explain that our productivity has increased? How do you explain that sales are up? How do you explain that companies are approaching us for partnerships precisely because of our social work?" The silence in the room was eloquent. "You can vote to remove me as president," Richard continued. "It's your right. But if you do that, you'll lose something money can't buy: soul. This company has a soul now, and that's worth more than any line on the balance sheet. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." The voting was tense, but in the end, Richard won by a narrow margin. Some shareholders sold their shares, dissatisfied. Others remained, still skeptical but willing to give it a chance. Dr. Caroline was one of those who stayed. "I believe in you, Richard, but you need to prove that this works in the long term." "I will prove it." And he did. Slowly, patiently, Richard showed that it was possible to have profit and purpose at the same time, that a company could grow without losing its humanity. Meanwhile, Tom continued his recovery. There were months of pain, of frustration, of small victories and big defeats. There were days when he wanted to give up, days when the suffering seemed greater than the hope. "I can't take it anymore," he said one afternoon, after a particularly painful physical therapy session. Mrs. Dorothy was there, as always. "I know, my son, I know it hurts." "It's not just the physical pain, Grandma. It's seeing everyone walking, running, doing simple things that I'll never be able to do." "Who said you'll never be able to? The doctor said the chances aren't certainties. You've overcome so many odds in your life already." "But I'm tired of fighting. Tired of being the poor little thing, the special one, the one who needs help." Mrs. Dorothy sat beside him, taking his hand. "Do you know what you are to me? Not the poor little thing, you're the bravest. You're the one who taught me not to give up when I thought I had nothing left. You're the one who gave me a reason to keep going when your mother passed and I thought I'd go with her." "Grandma, you think you're weak because your body doesn't respond as it should, but I see strength. I see a young man who gets up and fights every day, even when it would be easier to give up. That's not weakness, it's heroism." Tom began to cry, and Mrs. Dorothy cried with him. They were tears of pain, but also of connection, of love that transcended any physical limitation. Richard Miller watched the scene from afar, feeling a lump in his throat. That woman had a wisdom that no business school could teach, an ability to touch hearts that no leadership course could provide. That night, Richard had a long conversation with Nancy. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing." "Doing what?" "All of this. Investing so much in the social project, facing the shareholders, risking everything." "And you think you're not?" "I don't know. The numbers say yes. But what if it goes wrong? What if I end up losing everything?" Nancy looked at him with that expression he knew well, the one that said she was about to say something important. "Richard, when I met you, you were obsessed with success, working 18 hours a day, thinking about business even in your sleep. But do you know what I saw in your eyes? Emptiness. You were successful but empty. And now? Now I see life. I see purpose. I see a man who finally understood that success isn't about how much you have, but about who you are. But what if? There's no what if. You've already won. You might not see it yet, but you've won. Because even if you lose everything tomorrow, you'll have made a difference. You'll have changed lives. No one can take that away from you. Nancy's words echoed in Richard in the following days. She was right. He was no longer the same man who months ago had entered that warehouse thinking he'd find a trapped cat. The months passed, and Tom continued to progress. Slowly, but progressing. One day, he managed to move his little finger. Another day, he managed to flex his wrist, small achievements that were celebrated as great victories. And then, 6 months after the surgery, something nobody expected happened. Tom managed to stand up, with help, supported by bars, trembling with effort but standing. The whole warehouse stopped when the news spread. Employees dropped what they were doing and ran to the physical therapy room. And there was Tom, sweaty, exhausted, but standing, with Mrs. Dorothy crying beside him. "I did it, Grandma, I'm standing." "You are, my boy, you are." The scene was so moving that even the most skeptical shareholders who were visiting the factory that day were moved. Mr. Anderson, who had always been the most critical, had to leave the room to hide his tears. But life, as always, had more lessons to teach. 2 weeks after that triumphant day, Mrs. Dorothy didn't show up for work. It wasn't like her. Worried, Richard went to the house where she lived with Tom, a simple little house that the company had helped adapt. He found her in bed, clearly ill. "Mrs. Dorothy, what happened?" "It's nothing, just a cold." "It doesn't look like just a cold. I'll call a doctor." "No need, Mr. Richard, I've been through this before." But Richard didn't listen. He called the company doctor, who examined Mrs. Dorothy and became concerned. "She has pneumonia. She needs to be hospitalized." "No," Mrs. Dorothy tried to protest. "I can't leave Tom alone." "Tom will be fine. We'll take care of him," Richard assured. "But, no buts. Your health comes first." Mrs. Dorothy was hospitalized that same afternoon. What should have been a short stay became complicated. The pneumonia was more advanced than they thought. She spent days in the ICU fighting between life and the end. Tom, even while still recovering, insisted on staying at the hospital. Richard arranged everything so he could remain there in a comfortable chair by the ICU window, where he could see his grandmother through the glass. "She's going to be okay, isn't she?" he asked Richard one night. "The doctors are doing everything they can." "I can't lose her. Not after we've finally been together again. She's strong, stronger than anyone I know. But everyone has a limit, right?" Richard didn't know how to respond. It was true. Everyone had a limit. And Mrs. Dorothy had already surpassed so many. It was 2 weeks of anguish. The factory operated on autopilot. Margaret did her best to keep the warehouse project running, but the heart was absent. Everyone waited, prayed, cheered. And then, one morning, the doctor came out of the ICU with a smile. "She's past the worst. She's awake and asking to see her grandson." The joy was universal. Tom, who could barely move, practically flew in his wheelchair to the ICU glass. Mrs. Dorothy waved at him, weak but smiling. When she was finally transferred to a regular room and visits were allowed, Tom never left her side. "I thought you were going to leave me, Grandma." "And leave you alone in this world? Never. We still have so much to do together. But you need to take better care of yourself. You work too much. Work is what keeps me alive." "No, Grandma. I'm the one who keeps you alive. And you need to be here to see me walk without help. Because I'm going to do it." "Really?" "Yes. And I'm going to play piano on a real stage. And you'll be in the front row crying like you always do." Mrs. Dorothy laughed, a weak but genuine laugh. "I always cry. I can't help it." Mrs. Dorothy's recovery was slow. She returned home, but she was more fragile, more tired. Richard insisted that she take more rest time, but she was stubborn. "They've already given me too much rest. The project is suffering." "The project can wait. You can't." "Mr. Richard, I'm already old. I don't know how much time I have left. I want to use every day doing something that matters." "You are. Just by existing, you're making a difference." It's not enough. I need to work. Richard gave in, but with conditions. Mrs. Dorothy would return to work part-time, with frequent breaks and under constant medical supervision. She grumbled but accepted. Her return brought renewed energy to the project, but it also brought a new awareness to everyone. Mrs. Dorothy was human. She had limits, and one day she wouldn't be there anymore. It was Margaret who put into words what everyone was thinking. We need to be prepared for when Mrs. Dorothy can no longer lead the project. I don't want to think about that, Richard said. But you have to, she would say that herself. We can't depend only on her. Margaret was right, and Mrs. Dorothy, when she learned of the concern, agreed. I need to train successors, pass on everything I know. Who do you suggest? Several people. The project shouldn't depend on just one. It should be something bigger than any of us. In the following months, Mrs. Dorothy intensified the training of other artisans. She taught not only the craft techniques, but the philosophy behind the project. The reason for making each piece with love, for embroidering each name with care, for treating each client as a person, not as a number. And something beautiful began to happen. The project began to have a life of its own. It was no longer Mrs. Dorothy's project. It was everyone's project. Each person brought something unique, something that enriched the whole. Nancy, who had become increasingly involved, had an idea. What if we documented everything? The history, the techniques, the philosophy. Like a manual. More than that. Like a legacy, so that even 50 years from now people will know how it started and why. The idea was embraced by everyone. They began recording stories, filming interviews, photographing processes. Mrs. Dorothy told her full story for the first time, without omitting the painful moments. It was during these interviews that more details came to light, about the difficult years after Tom left, about the loneliness that almost consumed her, about the nights when she thought about giving up on everything. But why did you keep going? Nancy asked, recording. Because giving up would mean wasting everything my daughter suffered to bring Tom into the world. It would waste all the love my husband put into this factory. It would waste my own life, and I couldn't do that. Weren't you afraid? Every day. I wake up afraid. Afraid of not being good enough, of not making it, of letting down the people who depend on me. But fear doesn't paralyze me anymore. I learn to work even when I'm afraid. Those words deeply touched everyone who watched the interviews. Mrs. Dorothy wasn't a fearless hero. She was an ordinary woman who chose to be brave every day, despite her fear. And then came another twist. A documentary producer got in touch. They had heard about the project and wanted to make a film about it. Richard Miller was hesitant. I'm not sure if it's a good idea. It might look like propaganda. Or it could inspire other people, Nancy argued. Mrs. Dorothy, what do you think? She remained silent for a long moment. If it can help someone, if it can make one person who is suffering see that there's hope, then I think it's worth it. The documentary took months to make. The crew filmed the project's daily routine, interviewed beneficiaries, talked with employees, and they captured precious moments, like the day Tom finally took his first steps without help. It was a magical moment. Tom was in the physical therapy room doing his routine exercises. Suddenly something clicked. He let go of the bars and took a step, then another, and another. I'm walking, he whispered, almost not believing it. I'm walking. Mrs. Dorothy was there, as always, and broke down in tears. Richard was also there, checking progress reports, and dropped everything to hug the young man. You did it! Tom, you did it! It wasn't just me, Tom said, emotional. It was everyone. Grandma, Mr. Richard, the physical therapists, everyone who believed in me. That moment was captured by the documentary cameras and became one of the most emotional scenes in the film. When the documentary finally premiered, it had an impact no one expected. Millions of people watched it. Similar stories started emerging from all over the country. People with their own pains, their own challenges, were inspired by Mrs. Dorothy and Tom's example. Companies from various cities contacted Richard wanting to replicate the model. NGOs asked for guidance. Universities invited Mrs. Dorothy to give talks. She, humble as always, was taken aback by the attention. I didn't do anything special. I just tried to survive. That's exactly why you inspire, Richard said, because it shows that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. But not all attention was positive. Some competing companies started spreading rumors. They said it was all a marketing ploy, that Richard was exploiting Mrs. Dorothy, that the numbers were fake. Richard was furious when he heard the rumors. "How dare they?" "Let it go," Mrs. Dorothy said calmly. "Those who need to speak ill of others have nothing good to show for themselves." "But they're tarnishing our reputation." "Our reputation doesn't come from what others say about us, but from what we do. Keep doing good. The rest will take care of itself." And she was right. As time passed, the truth proved stronger than the rumors. The people who really knew the project knew what was true. But the attacks left a mark on Richard. He realized that the greater the visibility, the greater the responsibility. He couldn't make mistakes. He couldn't show weakness. Nancy noticed the weight he was carrying. "You need to slow down." "I can't. There's too much to do." "Richard, you're going to make yourself sick." "I'm fine." "You're not. You're sleeping poorly, eating poorly, always tense. It's a phase. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. Richard started having anxiety attacks. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with a racing heart, thinking something terrible was about to happen. During the day, he had trouble concentrating, always worried about 1,000 things at once. It was Mrs. Dorothy who confronted him. "Mr. Richard, may I speak frankly?" "Of course." "You're losing yourself again. Different from before, but still losing yourself." "What are you talking about?" "Before you were lost in work, in the pursuit of profit. Now you're lost in the pursuit of perfection, in proving you're right. It's another form of obsession, but it's still obsession." Richard wanted to disagree, but he couldn't. She was right. "I don't know how to stop." "You don't need to stop. You need to learn to let go, to trust that things will continue even when you're not controlling everything." "But what if something goes wrong?" "It will. Mistakes happen, but mistakes aren't the end of the world. They're opportunities to learn." That conversation was a turning point for Richard. He began to delegate more, to trust the team more, to accept that he couldn't control everything. And ironically, when he let go of control, things started working better. People felt more empowered, more responsible. The project grew in ways Richard had never imagined. 1 year after the documentary, the project had expanded to 5 different cities, each with its own cooperative, its own style, but all following the same fundamental principles that Mrs. Dorothy had established. The original factory became a kind of center of excellence where people from other cooperatives came to learn. Mrs. Dorothy, now 70 years old, had reduced her work pace even further, but remained essential as a mentor. Tom, fully recovered, not only walked, but also began teaching music professionally. He developed a special method for children with special needs, based on his own experience. "Every child has something unique to offer," he said in his classes. "Our job isn't to fix them, but to help them flourish as they are." Richard watched everything with a mix of pride and humility. He hadn't saved anyone. In fact, he had been saved. By a woman he found crying in an abandoned warehouse. By a young man who refused to give up. By employees who embraced a greater vision. But there was one last lesson life needed to teach him, and it came unexpectedly. Mr. Anderson, the shareholder who had always been most critical of the social project, approached Richard one day. "I need to speak with you, in private." Richard grew worried. "More problems?" "Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out." Now continuing. They sat in a private room. Mr. Anderson seemed uncomfortable. "I want to apologize." Richard blinked, surprised. "Apologize for what?" "For being so resistant to your project, for questioning every step, for putting profit above people. You were protecting your investment. It's understandable." "No, Richard, I was protecting my own ego, my own fear of being irrelevant. I don't understand." Mr. Anderson sighed deeply. "I have a son, James. He has severe autism. I spent my whole life hiding it, ashamed, thinking it was my failure. I put him in institutions, in special schools, anywhere away from me, because I didn't know how to handle it." Richard remained silent, letting the man continue. "When I saw you investing in Tom, When I saw all this dedication to a social cause, I felt angry. Because it reminded me of what I wasn't capable of doing for my own son. It was easier to criticize you than to face my own failure. What changed? My wife made me watch the documentary. I didn't want to, but she insisted, and when I saw the story of Mrs. Dorothy, of Tom, of everyone, I broke down. I cried like I hadn't cried in decades, and I realized I had wasted years of my son's life out of pride. It's not too late, isn't it? It never is. If the documentary taught me anything, it's that change is always possible. Mr. Anderson wiped the tears from his eyes. I'd like to bring James to meet Tom. Do you think that would be possible? Of course, more than possible, it would be an honor. The meeting between James and Tom was moving. James was 25 years old, but in many ways seemed like a child. He didn't speak much, communicating more through gestures and sounds. But when Tom started playing the piano, something magical happened. James approached the piano, fascinated. Tom, noticing the interest, placed the young man's hands on the keys, and James began to play. It wasn't an organized melody, but it had rhythm, it had intention, it had soul. Mr. Anderson cried, seeing his son express something he had never been able to express before. And in that moment, all his skepticism, all his resistance completely melted away. "I'm sorry," he said to Richard, "for everything. No need to be sorry. What matters is that you're here now." In the following months, Mr. Anderson became one of the biggest supporters of the social project. He even started his own foundation, focused on people with autism, using the principles he had learned from Mrs. Dorothy. And that was just one of the many transformation stories the project inspired. Richard began receiving letters from all over the country, from people telling how the story had changed them, how they had found the courage to face their own challenges. But not everything was celebration. The rapid expansion of the project brought new problems. Some cooperatives couldn't sustain themselves. Others strayed from the original principles, focusing only on profit. Richard had to make difficult decisions. He closed cooperatives that didn't follow the core values. He confronted people who were using the project's name for personal gain. It was tough but necessary. "It's the hard part of building something big," Mrs. Dorothy said, when he shared his frustrations. "Not everyone understands. Not everyone is ready." "How do you deal with it?" "By accepting. I can't control others' choices. I can only control my own, and keep doing what I believe is right." This simple wisdom became Richard's motto. He stopped trying to control everything, stopped getting frustrated with every failure. He focused on what he could do, on what was within his reach, and surprisingly, that brought more peace than any material success ever had. 5 years after that first meeting in the warehouse, Richard organized a celebration, not just for the project's anniversary, but for everything they had built together. The event brought together hundreds of people, artisans from the cooperatives, children helped by the programs, families assisted, employees, shareholders, everyone who in some way had been part of that journey. Mrs. Dorothy was there, now 73 years old, slower but still steady. Tom was by her side, now a recognized and respected music teacher. Richard went up on stage to speak. He looked at the audience and felt a deep emotion. "When I started this company, I had one goal: to grow, to get rich, to be successful according to the standards society defines, and I succeeded, but it was empty. I had money, but I had no purpose. I had success, but I had no meaning." He paused, looking directly at Mrs. Dorothy. "Until I found a woman crying in an abandoned warehouse, and I thought she was crazy. I thought she needed to be sent away. But she taught me something no business school teaches, that true success isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we give. That power doesn't come from controlling, but from serving. That the meaning of life isn't in how much we have, but in how many lives we touch." The applause was emotional. Mrs. Dorothy, tears in her eyes, waved timidly. "Today we celebrate 5 years of the project, but actually we celebrate much more. We celebrate second chances. We celebrate transformation. We celebrate the proof that an ordinary person with love and determination can change the world. Not the whole world, perhaps, but someone's world. And that's all that matters. Tom asked to speak next. When my grandmother sent me away, I thought she didn't love me anymore. I thought I was too heavy a burden. I spent 3 years feeling abandoned, rejected, but now I understand she did that because she loved me, because she wanted me to have a better chance. She didn't abandon me, she sacrificed herself. His voice broke, but he continued. And Mr. Richard didn't have to help us. It would have been easier to just send us away, to focus on his business. But he chose the hard path, the path of seeing in us what we couldn't even see in ourselves, and for that I'll be eternally grateful. Margaret also spoke, sharing how the project had changed her own life, how she discovered talents she didn't know she had, how she found a family at work, how she learned that age isn't a limit to grow. Story after story, person after person, everyone sharing how that project, born from a desperate woman's crying, had transformed their lives. When the celebration ended, Richard stayed alone in the warehouse for a few moments. He looked around, remembering how that place was 5 years ago. Dark, empty, abandoned. Just like he was inside. Now it was full of light, life, purpose. Just like him. "What are you thinking about?" Nancy asked, appearing by his side. "About how everything changed. About how I changed." "Regretful?" "On the contrary, I've never been so sure of anything in my life. Even with all the problems, all the challenges. Exactly because of them. Because they make me grow. They make me better." Nancy hugged him. "I'm proud of you. Of the man you've become. I wouldn't have made it without you, without Mrs. Dorothy, without Tom, without everyone." "That's true. But you were the one who had the courage to change. Many would have simply continued on the easy path." Richard thought about that. She was right. It would have been easier to continue as he was. Easier, but not better. The weeks following the celebration brought a new energy. Inspired by the original project's success, 3 new cooperatives formed in neighboring towns, each with its own focus, but all following the same core values. Richard was in a meeting with the new cooperatives coordinators when his phone rang. It was from the hospital. Mrs. Dorothy had fainted again. He rushed out of the meeting, his heart racing. He couldn't lose her. Not now, not after everything. He found Tom in the hospital hallway, his face pale with worry. "What happened?" "I don't know. She was fine this morning, working normally. Suddenly she collapsed." "Did the doctors say anything?" "They're investigating, but she's very weak, Mr. Richard, very." Richard felt the world spinning. Mrs. Dorothy was strong, she always had been, but she was human, she had limits. And at 73 years old, after a lifetime of struggle, her body might be saying it was time to rest. The doctor came to speak with them hours later. "It's her heart. It's very tired. She'll need surgery." "When?" "As soon as possible. But I need to be honest with you. At her age, with her health history, the risks are high." "How high?" 50% chance of success." The silence was heavy. Tom began to cry silently. Richard felt his own tears but tried to be strong. "What happens if we don't do the surgery?" "She has maybe a few months. And they'll be difficult months with lots of limitations, lots of pain. And her? What does she want?" "I haven't been able to talk to her yet. She's very weak." When they finally allowed visits, Richard and Tom entered the room together. Mrs. Dorothy was lying down, connected to several machines, looking smaller and more fragile than ever. "Grandma," Tom held her hand, "you need to have the surgery." She opened her eyes slowly. "I don't know if I want to." "Don't talk like that. I'm tired, my son, so tired. But we need you, I need you." Mrs. Dorothy smiled weakly. "You don't need me anymore, no. You're strong, you're fine. You can walk on your own now. Physically, yes, but emotionally I still do. I always will." "You want to know the truth?" She looked at both of them. "I'm not afraid of the surgery. I'm afraid of waking up and discovering that everything we built has crumbled, that I did so much, but in the end, it didn't last." "It won't crumble," Richard said firmly, "because you built something solid. You built it on true foundations: love, purpose, community. Those things don't crumble easily." How can you be sure? Because we've already been tested. We've already been through crises, through doubts, through attacks, and we're still here, stronger. Mrs. Dorothy fell silent, thinking. All right, she finally said. I'll have the surgery. But if something happens, nothing will happen, Tom interrupted her. If something happens, she insisted, I want you to continue. I want the project not to end with me. I want it to grow, to spread, to touch more and more lives. We promise, Richard said, his voice choked up. The surgery was scheduled for 2 days later. They were 48 hours of anguish, of waiting, of prayer. Richard barely slept. Nancy stayed by his side, offering the silent comfort of her presence. What if we lose her? He asked on the night before the surgery. You won't lose her, she's too strong. But what if we do? Nancy took his hands. If you lose her, it will hurt. It will hurt a lot, but you will continue. Because it's what she would want, and because everything she taught doesn't die when she leaves. It stays in every person she touched, in every life she transformed. On the day of the surgery, the hospital was packed. Factory workers, artisans from the cooperatives, families they had helped, everyone had come to show their support. It was a silent but powerful demonstration of how much Mrs. Dorothy mattered. The hours of surgery were the longest of Richard's life. He paced back and forth, unable to stay still. Tom was in his wheelchair, silent, squeezing a small cloth doll in his hands, the same one his grandmother had soothed him with at their first meeting. Where did you get that? Richard asked. I never got rid of it. It was all I had of her when we were apart. Finally, after 6 hours, the surgeon came out. His face was hard to read. The surgery was technically successful, he began, and everyone let out the breath they were holding. But the next 48 hours will be critical. She's in the ICU. We will monitor her constantly. Can we see her? Only through the window for now. She's sedated and will be for a few more hours. Tom went to the ICU window and stood there, looking at his grandmother through the glass. Richard stood beside him. She's going to be okay, Tom said, more to himself than to Richard. She has to be. She will be, Richard agreed, trying to believe his own words. The 48 hours passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. Mrs. Dorothy remained stable, but she didn't wake up. The doctors said it was normal that her body was recovering, but the uncertainty weighed heavily. And then, on the morning of the 3rd day, she opened her eyes. Tom was there, as always. He saw her eyes open and almost shouted for joy. Grandma! You're awake! Mrs. Dorothy looked around, disoriented. It took her a few seconds to remember where she was. When she saw Tom, she smiled weakly. I'm still here, she whispered. You are, and you'll be here for a long time. Promise? I promise, because we need you, because the world needs you. The recovery was slow, slower than they would have liked, more full of setbacks than they had expected. But Mrs. Dorothy was stubborn. Even when the doctors told her to rest, she wanted to work. Even when the pain was great, she smiled. Why are you always smiling? A nurse asked one day. Because I'm alive. Because my grandson is here. Because I have purpose. Why not smile? That simple answer touched the nurse deeply. She shared it with other colleagues. And soon, Mrs. Dorothy was inspiring even the medical team taking care of her. 3 weeks after the surgery, she was finally discharged. The entire hospital came to say goodbye. Doctors, nurses, cleaning staff, everyone came to hug that woman who, in such a short time, had touched so many hearts. When she returned to the factory, she was welcomed as a hero. A huge banner said, "Welcome back, Mrs. Dorothy." There were flowers, balloons, hugs, tears of joy. It feels like I won a war, she joked. You did, Richard said seriously. You won several. But the surgery left its marks. Mrs. Dorothy no longer had the same energy as before. She tired easily, needed frequent breaks. For the first time, she admitted she was getting old. There's no shame in that, Nancy said, when Mrs. Dorothy expressed her frustration. You gave everything you had. Now you can slow down. But there's still so much to do. And it will get done, but it doesn't all have to be by you. Gradually, Mrs. Dorothy took on more of a mentor role than an executor. She taught, guided, inspired. But the heavy work was left to others, and surprisingly, the project didn't suffer. On the contrary, by having to rely less on her, the other people grew. They developed their own ideas, their own talents. It was Margaret who proposed something new, a line of premium products made with high-quality materials for a more sophisticated corporate market. Mrs. Dorothy was hesitant at first, thinking it would stray from the original purpose. It doesn't stray, Margaret argued. It expands. With more profit from the premium products, we can donate even more to the social programs. The logic made sense, and it worked. The premium line was a success, opening doors for partnerships with large companies. And as Margaret had promised, the profit was used to expand the social programs. 1 year after the surgery, Mrs. Dorothy was at a corporate event representing the project. It was a conference on business with social impact. She didn't want to go. She thought she had nothing to contribute to businessmen in suits and ties. But Richard insisted, "You have more to teach than any speaker who will be there." "I don't speak well. I don't use fancy words." "And that's exactly why you need to go. Because you speak from the heart, not with corporate jargon." When it was her turn to speak, Mrs. Dorothy went up on stage, trembling. There were hundreds of people in the audience, all well-dressed, important, successful. She started to speak, and her voice came out shaky. "I don't know why you invited me. I'm just an old lady who does crafts." But as she continued, something changed. She forgot the fear, forgot the intimidating audience, and she told her story, without embellishing, without omitting the difficult moments. She told them about the grandson she had to send away, about the empty warehouse where she cried, about the businessman who found her and who could easily have sent her away. "You people here are successful," she said. "You have companies, you have money, you have power. But let me ask you, do you have purpose? Do you wake up every day knowing you are making a difference in someone's life? Or do they simply wake up to make more money?" The silence in the room was absolute. "There's nothing wrong with making money. We need it to live. But if that's all there is, if at the end of life all we leave behind is a bank account, what kind of legacy is that? What kind of life is that?" "I built what I built not because I was smart or talented. I built because I suffered, because I knew the pain of feeling like nothing mattered. And in that pain, I discovered that the only thing that truly matters is how we touch the lives of others." She paused, looking around. "You can do much more than I did. You have more resources, more reach, more power. But if you don't use that for something bigger than yourselves, you'll be wasting it. And when you reach my age, you'll look back and wonder why you didn't do more, why you weren't braver." When she finished, the silence lingered for a few seconds, and then the entire audience rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't polite or protocol. It was genuine, heartfelt. After the talk, dozens of people sought out Mrs. Dorothy, wanting advice, wanting help to start similar projects, wanting just to thank her for saying what they needed to hear. Richard watched it all with pride. That woman he had met years ago, broken and desperate, was now inspiring CEOs and top executives. But Mrs. Dorothy, being who she was, didn't let it go to her head. The next day she was back at the warehouse, teaching a new craftswoman how to make crochet stitches. "You were amazing yesterday," Margaret commented. "It was just a talk." "It was much more than that. You touched hearts. If I did, it's because I spoke the truth. It's no use saying pretty words if they aren't true." The months passed and the project continued to grow, but not just in size, in depth. Each cooperative developed its own identity, keeping the core values but adapting to its local reality. One of the cooperatives in a small town in Minnesota began working with refugees, teaching them American crafts, helping them integrate, giving them purpose in a strange land. Another in New Orleans focused on women who were victims of abusive relationships, offering not just work, but a support network, a safe place where they could rebuild themselves. Each of these stories touched Richard deeply. It was proof that what had started in the warehouse of that factory in Pittsburgh was spreading, taking root in places he never imagined it would reach. But not everything was good news. 2 of the cooperatives went bankrupt, not for lack of will, but due to poor management, internal conflicts, and an inability to adapt to market realities. Richard felt each failure as a personal blow. Mrs. Dorothy, however, kept perspective. Not everything works, and that's okay. How can you say that? These are people who trusted us. And we tried. We gave everything we could. But we can't control everything. Some seeds don't sprout, no matter how much care you take. That doesn't mean you stop planting. That wisdom, born from a lifetime of ups and downs, helped Richard move forward. He learned to celebrate successes without clinging to them, and to accept failures without being destroyed by them. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 2 years after Mrs. Dorothy's surgery, something unexpected happened. Tom announced that he was engaged. The bride was Sarah, one of the students from the music class he taught. She also had physical limitations, the result of a childhood accident, but that never stopped her from loving music and living life to the fullest. The wedding was celebrated in the warehouse itself, now transformed into a beautiful and welcoming multi-purpose space. Mrs. Dorothy cried from the beginning to the end of the ceremony. They were tears of pure joy, seeing the grandson she had raised, who had suffered so much, now happy and fulfilled. "I never thought I would see this day," she confessed to Richard during the party. "But you did. Because you didn't give up. Because you fought." "No, Mr. Richard, I saw it because you didn't send me away that first day, because you chose to see in me something beyond a crazy woman crying in the warehouse. I didn't do anything special. You did everything. You made the difference between life and the end, between hope and despair." Richard hugged Mrs. Dorothy, feeling the fragility of her body, but also the unshakable strength of her spirit. Tom's wedding marked a new phase in everyone's life. He and Sarah moved into a small but cozy house, not too far from the factory. Mrs. Dorothy could finally rest, knowing that her grandson was well, was happy. She continued working, but now only 3 days a week, a few hours a day. She spent more time at home, cultivating a garden, receiving visitors, enjoying the peace that had eluded her for so long. But peace did not mean inactivity. Mrs. Dorothy started writing. Not a formal book, but letters. Letters to every artisan, to every person who had been part of the project. Personal, specific letters, speaking of the unique qualities she saw in each one. "Why are you doing this?" Margaret asked. "Because I want them to know. I want each person to know how important they were, how much they made a difference, before it's too late." The letters deeply touched those who received them. Many were framed, others kept as treasures. They were simple words, but filled with truth and love. Richard also received a letter. When he opened and read it, he had to sit down, too emotional to stand. "Dear Mr. Richard, I've never been good with pretty words. I've always been better at doing than talking. But today I want to try to put into words what you mean to me and to so many others. You saved my life. You don't think so, I know. You think you just offered a second chance, a job, some support. But you did much more than that. You gave me back my dignity. You gave me back my purpose. You gave me back my will to live. That night when you found me in the warehouse, I was at the end, not just crying over the separation from my Tommy, but crying over a whole life of losses, of struggles, of feeling invisible. I was ready to give up on everything. But you didn't give up on me. Even when I gave you reasons, even when it seemed like it wasn't worth it, you didn't give up. And that changed everything. Today, when I look around and see how many lives have been touched, how many people have found hope, I know that none of this would have happened without you. Not because of the money, not because of the resources, but because you had the courage to see humanity where others would only see a problem. You learned from me, you always say, but I also learned from you. I learned that it's possible to be successful without losing your soul, that it's possible to have power without using it to oppress, that it's possible to change even when we're already old and stuck in our ways. I don't know how much time I have left. At my age, every day is a gift, but I want you to know that when my time comes, I will go in peace, because I lived, I truly lived. not just existing but making a difference. And that, this possibility of living with purpose, you gave me. I can never repay you properly, but I can thank you. From the bottom of my tired but happy heart. Thank you. With all my affection and admiration, Dorothy. Richard read the letter 3 times. Each time, he found new meanings, deeper layers. He kept it in a frame on his desk, where he could see it every day the years passed. The project continued to grow, now in 17 cities, benefiting thousands of people. Richard began to receive awards, recognition, invitations to speak internationally. But he always made sure to give credit to Mrs. Dorothy. He always took her with him when possible, always spoke of her as the true founder, the true inspiration. "You are the face of the project," he would say. "No, Mr. Richard, I'm just one of the many hands that built it. You are the heart. Without you, it would just be another soulless corporate project." Mrs. Dorothy turned 75, surrounded by love. The party was in the warehouse, naturally. Hundreds of people attended, people of all ages, from all the cooperatives, from all the places the project had touched. Tom organized a special musical performance. Children he taught played pieces composed especially for their grandmother. It was moving, beautiful, perfect. "You made 75 years seem like nothing," Richard joked. "It's because these last years have been so full they feel like they lasted a whole lifetime," she replied. "Regret anything?" Mrs. Dorothy thought for a long moment. "Nothing. Not even the hard parts. Because it was in the hard parts that I grew, that I learned, that I became who I am." That answer stayed with Richard. Years spent trying to avoid difficulties, trying to have a perfect life without problems. But it was precisely in the difficulties, the challenges, the crises, that he had found his true self. But life, relentless as ever, had more lessons to teach. 3 months after Mrs. Dorothy's birthday, she had another heart episode. Less severe than the previous one, but worrying. The doctors were clear. She needed to slow down even more, work once a week at most, no stress. Mrs. Dorothy resisted at first, but her body didn't lie. She tired more and more easily. Simple tasks became exhausting. "It's time for me to really retire," she admitted to Richard. "Only from the physical work. We still need your advice, your wisdom. There are so many younger people more capable, younger perhaps, but no one has what you have, the experience, the perspective, the heart." Mrs. Dorothy accepted a new role, advisor. She no longer went to the warehouse every day, but she was always available. A phone call, a visit, a coffee, and in these casual conversations, she continued teaching, guiding, inspiring. Richard began to notice, with a heavy heart, that Mrs. Dorothy was preparing. She didn't speak explicitly, but she was putting things in order, writing more letters, having important conversations, saying goodbye gently. "Don't talk like that," he said one day when she casually mentioned "when I'm no longer here." "I need to talk, Mr. Richard. I don't know how much time I have. No one does. But I know I'm closer to the end than the beginning, and I need to make sure everything will continue without me." "It will continue. You built something solid." "I hope so. But even if it doesn't continue exactly as it is, it will continue in some way. The seeds have been planted. Some will bloom in ways we can't even imagine." That serene realism, that calm acceptance of mortality, both impressed and saddened Richard. Mrs. Dorothy wasn't afraid, wasn't in denial. She was simply at peace. The months passed. Mrs. Dorothy continued fulfilling her role as advisor, but her appearances became increasingly spaced out. Her body was clearly slowing down, preparing for the end. Tom and Sarah cared for her with affection and dedication. She lived with them now, unable to live alone. And, ironically, that dependence she had so feared turned out to be a blessing. It brought a closeness and intimacy that they might not have had otherwise. "You know what's funny?" she said to Tom one day. "I spent my whole life taking care of you, and now you're taking care of me. The wheel has turned. And I do it with joy, Grandma. You gave me everything. This is the least I can do. You gave me something that no care can repay. It gave me a reason to live, to fight, to not give up. Then it was mutual, because you gave me that too. That particularly cold winter, Mrs. Dorothy caught a bad flu. Her fragile body fought, but the infection spread. Pneumonia again. But this time, more severe. She was hospitalized, but the doctors weren't optimistic. Her heart is too weak. I don't know if she'll make it. Richard and Nancy went to the hospital every day, as did dozens of other people. Mrs. Dorothy's room became a constant parade of visitors, people wanting to say goodbye, wanting to thank her one last time. She welcomed everyone with a weak but genuine smile. She asked about their lives, their projects, how they were doing, even in her final days, concerned about others more than herself. One afternoon, when Richard was alone with her, Mrs. Dorothy asked to talk. "I want to ask one final favor. Anything. Don't let them make me a saint. I don't want to be idealized when I'm gone." "Why do you say that?" "Because I wasn't a saint. I was just a woman who did the best she could with what she had. I made mistakes, had flaws, moments of weakness. If they turn me into something perfect, they'll miss the real lesson." "What lesson?" "That you don't need to be perfect to make a difference. That you don't need to be special or extraordinary. That ordinary people, with all their flaws and limitations, can change lives. That's the real message. Not that I was incredible, but that anyone can be." Richard held her hand, feeling the tears streaming down. "I promise. And take care of my Tommy. I know he's an adult now, has his wife, his life, but he still needs guidance sometimes. Be that guidance when he needs it." "I will. And keep going. Keep touching lives. Keep showing that businesses can have a soul. Keep being the bridge between profit and purpose. I'll keep going." "As long as I have the strength," Mrs. Dorothy smiled. "You will have the strength, because now you know where it comes from. It doesn't come from you, but from everyone you touch, everyone who touches you. It's an endless chain." That was one of their last coherent conversations. In the following days, Mrs. Dorothy drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she was present, sometimes distant. Tom never left her side. He slept in a chair in the room, woke at the slightest moan, held her hand for hours on end. "Grandma," he whispered, "you can go. You can rest. Everything will be all right. I'll be all right." As if waiting for that permission, Mrs. Dorothy passed away in the early hours of the next morning, peacefully, without pain, simply stopping breathing. Tom was by her side, holding her hand. The grief that followed was profound. Not just Tom and Richard, but hundreds of people felt the blow. It was as if a light had gone out in the world. The funeral was immense. The factory closed for a day. People came from all the cooperatives, from all the cities where the project had a presence. The warehouse, where it all began, was turned into a temporary memorial. Richard gave the eulogy, trying to maintain his composure. Mrs. Dorothy always said she didn't want to be seen as a saint, that she was just an ordinary woman. And she was right. She was ordinary in the sense that she had flaws, fears, limitations. But she was extraordinary in her courage to continue despite that, in her refusal to give up even when it would have been easier, in her ability to see light even in the deepest darkness. He paused, too emotional to continue for a moment. "She transformed my life. She transformed this company. She transformed hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. Not because she had superpowers, but because she had love. Genuine, selfless, unconditional love. And that kind of love moves mountains. The project will continue. It's what she would have wanted. But it will never be the same without her. It will never have the same light, the same warmth, and that's okay, because she didn't want the project to depend on her. She wanted it to have a life of its own. And there is, thanks to her." After the funeral, Richard stayed alone in the warehouse for hours. He looked around, remembering how it all began, the crying in the early morning, the woman rocking a doll, the decision not to send her away. If he had made a different decision that night, none of this would exist. Hundreds of lives would not have been touched. He himself would still be the empty, obsessed businessman he was before. One decision, one moment of compassion instead of judgment. That was all it took to change everything. The months after Mrs. Dorothy's departure were difficult. The project continued, but there was a palpable void. People did the work, but something was missing. The inspiration, perhaps. The living example of what was possible. Tom especially struggled. He lost weight, became distant, questioned whether it was still worth continuing. It was Sarah, his wife, who pulled him back. Your grandmother didn't fight so hard for you to give up now. She gave you the greatest gift she could, a full life, despite all the limitations. Honor that. Live. I don't know if I can do it without her. You don't have to do it without her. She is here. Sarah touched his chest. She's in every lesson she taught, in every value she passed on. You didn't lose her. She just changed form. Those words, coming from someone he deeply loved, made a difference. Tom slowly began to recover. He returned to teaching music. He returned to composing. He returned to living. And something beautiful emerged from his pain. Tom began to write music about his grandmother, about their journey together. Honest songs that didn't hide the pain but transformed it into something beautiful. One of these songs became particularly special. It was called Crying in the Warehouse. It told the whole story from that first night to the end. It was moving, it was true, it was a perfect tribute. When Tom performed it for the first time, at a concert in the very warehouse, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Richard cried openly without shame. Nancy beside him did too. That song spread. People started sharing it online. A famous singer recorded it. And suddenly, Mrs. Dorothy's story was reaching millions of people who had never met her, but who were inspired by her. Would she have liked this? Tom asked Richard. She would have been embarrassed, but also happy, because it wasn't about her. It was about the message, and the message is reaching those who need it. 2 years after Mrs. Dorothy's departure, Richard had an epiphany. He was 70 years old, much older than when it all began, and he realized that he too was preparing to eventually pass the torch. He began training successors, not just one, but several. Just as Mrs. Dorothy had done, he wanted to ensure that the project didn't depend on any one specific person. Nancy, who had always been a silent partner, began to take on a more active role. She had a way with people, a natural empathy that perfectly complemented Richard's business vision. I should have given you more space from the beginning, he admitted. I wasn't ready, but now I am, and we'll do this together. Together, they began to implement changes. Small things that would make a big difference in the long run. A succession fund ensuring the project would continue even if something happened to them. Partnerships with universities, bringing research and innovation. International expansion, taking the model to other countries. But through it all, they maintained the core values that Mrs. Dorothy had established. Love, purpose, community. No sophistication that sacrificed the soul of the project. One day, Richard received a letter. It was from a woman from another state whom he had never met. She told how Mrs. Dorothy's story had inspired her not to give up on a grandchild with a disability she was raising, how she had found hope when she saw no way out. Richard read the letter several times, and he realized that was exactly it. Mrs. Dorothy hadn't just saved the people she met personally. He had saved people he didn't even know existed through the example of his life. That was the true legacy. Not the project itself, not the cooperatives, not the products. It was the inspiration. The living proof that it was possible to overcome, that it was worth fighting, that a life had meaning when lived with purpose. 5 years after Mrs. Dorothy's passing, Richard organized a special event, not to celebrate the growth of the project, but to celebrate her life. A living memorial. They invited everyone who had been touched by her. People came from all corners of the country. Each brought a story, a memory, a lesson they had learned. She taught me that age is no excuse not to dream, said Margaret. She taught me that physical limitations don't define who we are, said Tom. She taught me that businesses can have a soul, said Richard. Story after story, a complete portrait of Mrs. Dorothy emerged, not a perfect saint, but a real woman, with all her complexities, and it was exactly this reality that made her so inspiring. At the end of the event, Tom played Crying in the Warehouse again, but this time it wasn't sad. It was a celebration, a celebration of a life well lived, of a legacy well established, of love that transcended existence itself. Richard, now 75 years old, the same age Mrs. Dorothy was when she passed away, felt peace. Peace in knowing he had honored the promise he made, that the project continued, stronger than ever, that the message was spreading. He thought of that first night, of the sound of crying that led him to the warehouse, of the woman he found there, broken but not defeated, and of how a single decision, a single moment of compassion, changed the course of so many lives. "Thank you," he whispered, to no one in particular. Perhaps to Mrs. Dorothy, wherever she was, perhaps to the universe, perhaps to himself. Thank you for not letting me ignore that crying, because if I had ignored it, I would have lost not only the chance to help someone, but the chance to find myself, to discover who I really was under all the layers of ambition and ego, to learn that true success isn't measured in money, but in lives touched. And looking around the full warehouse, seeing the hundreds of people gathered there, each with their own story of transformation, Richard knew Mrs. Dorothy had won. Not only her own personal battle, but the greater battle. The battle to prove that love, purpose, and community matter more than any financial balance. Her legacy wasn't the products they made or the money they generated. It was the living proof that an ordinary person with an extraordinary heart could change the world. Not the whole world, perhaps, but someone's world. And that was everything. End of story. And you, dear listener, what did you think of this journey of Richard and Mrs. Dorothy? Have you experienced something similar? Leave in the comments where you're following us from and what struck you most in this story. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the soul.